The Suez Crisis of 1956 is often remembered as a brief, almost cinematic conflict involving Egypt, Britain, France, and Israel. Textbooks summarize it as a dispute over a canal, but the deeper truth is far more complex. A web of post-war geopolitics, Cold War tension, national pride, and the fading legacy of empire. On July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal, a vital artery for global trade and oil transportation that had been controlled largely by British and French interests for decades. On the surface, it seemed like a straightforward national assertion of sovereignty. Yet the announcement triggered one of the most dramatic confrontations of the 20th century. The roots of the crisis stretch back to the end of World War II. Britain and France emerged from the war with weakened economies but retained global empires. Egypt had technically gained independence in 1922, yet British troops remained stationed along the Suez. And Western companies controlled major infrastructure and profits. Nationalist sentiment simmered across the Middle East, fueled by resentment toward lingering colonial control and a desire for economic self-determination. Nasser, a charismatic army officer who had come to power through the Free Officers Movement in 1952, represented the rising tide of post-colonial leadership, ambitious, assertive, and unwilling to accept the limitations imposed by former imperial powers. The immediate spark for the Suez Crisis was Nasser's decision to nationalize the canal. Western leaders perceived this as a direct threat to their economic interests and strategic influence. The Suez Canal had been a lifeline, particularly for Britain, through which oil from the Persian Gulf flowed to Europe. Losing control of this choke point threatened both British energy security and global maritime commerce. For France, the canal was also symbolic. Alongside Britain, it represented the ability of European powers to project influence in a region increasingly hostile to imperialism. But the nationalization was also Nasser's masterstroke. By seizing the canal, he simultaneously asserted Egypt's sovereignty, gained revenue to fund the Aswan High Dam after the United States withdrew support, and positioned himself as a leading figure in Arab nationalism. Behind the headlines, secret negotiations and military planning were already underway. Britain and France conspired with Israel to mount a coordinated response. Israel, eager to secure its southern border against Fedayeen attacks from Gaza and Sinai, was willing to act militarily if it meant pressuring Egypt. The plan, known later as the Sevres Protocol, involved Israel invading the Sinai Peninsula, providing a pretext for Britain and France to intervene ostensibly as peacekeepers. This collusion revealed not only strategic calculation but also desperation. Both European powers knew that their imperial influence in the Middle East was waning and were unwilling to accept a regional leader challenging their supremacy. The invasion began in late October 1956. Israeli forces rapidly advanced into the Sinai, meeting limited resistance. Britain and France issued an ultimatum to Egypt, demanding a ceasefire and withdrawal from the Canal Zone. When Nasser refused, Anglo-French forces launched airborne and amphibious assaults near Port Said, attempting to seize the canal under the guise of enforcing peace. Despite superior firepower, the operation encountered logistical challenges, unexpected resistance, and global condemnation. Nasser's forces, though outmatched militarily, were bolstered by patriotic fervor and a perception that they were defending national honor. Civilian support amplified the political impact, turning the conflict into a rallying point for anti-imperialist sentiment across the Arab world. The Suez Crisis was not merely a regional conflict. It unfolded on the global stage during the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union watched closely, each for different reasons. The U.S., led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was concerned that Anglo-French military action would destabilize the Middle East, drive Arab nations toward the Soviet bloc, and undermine American influence. Washington applied intense diplomatic and financial pressure on Britain and France. including threats to destabilize the British economy by selling off pounds and restricting IMF support. The Soviet Union, for its part, issued veiled threats and mobilized forces along its borders, eager to exploit anti-Western sentiment for propaganda and strategic leverage. In the end, global pressure forced Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw, marking a humiliating setback for European powers and a triumph for Nasser. The crisis reshaped international politics. Britain's rapid decline as a global power became undeniable, exposing the limitations of even traditional imperial nations in the nuclear age. France, too, recognized the need to rethink its role in the world, setting the stage for future decolonization efforts. Israel gained temporary military objectives, but also faced scrutiny for its participation in a conflict framed as Western aggression. For Egypt and Nasser personally, the crisis was a masterstroke of political theater. He emerged as a hero across the Arab world, his image as a strong, independent leader cemented. Nationalization not only survived military opposition, but also became a symbol of resistance to imperialism and foreign control. Economic and strategic consequences of the crisis were profound. While Nasser secured revenue from the canal, global shipping had been temporarily disrupted, and international powers quickly sought multilateral agreements to prevent similar incidents in the future. The crisis demonstrated the vulnerability of unilateral military intervention in an era dominated by global media, instant communication, and superpower diplomacy. Public opinion in Europe, North America, and the Middle East highlighted the declining tolerance for overt imperialist action. The Suez Crisis became a case study in the limits of conventional military power when confronted with geopolitical, economic, and media pressures. The narrative surrounding the Suez Crisis also revealed the power of perception in shaping history. Western accounts often framed Nasser as reckless, even authoritarian, threatening free trade and stability. Meanwhile, Arab narratives celebrated his vision of independence, modernization, and Arab unity. These divergent perspectives illustrate how the same events can be interpreted in dramatically different ways depending on political, cultural, and ideological lenses. Over time, the Suez Crisis has been reassessed by historians as a pivotal moment in the decline of colonialism, the rise of post-colonial states, and the emergence of a truly multipolar world order. The lessons of the Suez Crisis extend beyond military history. They show how national pride, economic imperatives, and the perception of strategic necessity can collide, producing outcomes that are as unpredictable as they are transformative. Britain and France underestimated the political and psychological impact of Nasser's actions and overestimated their ability to enforce control. Nasser, on the other hand, skillfully manipulated international attention, turning military pressure into political gain. The episode underscores the fact that in modern geopolitics, influence is not determined solely by military capability, but also by diplomacy, public opinion, and the ability to navigate complex international institutions. The aftermath of the Suez Crisis highlighted how swiftly global dynamics had changed in the post-war era. Britain and France, once the unquestioned masters of global influence, discovered that military might alone no longer guarantee political success. International institutions, particularly the United Nations, became arenas where diplomatic pressure could outweigh traditional power. The UN played a crucial role in supervising the ceasefire and deploying peacekeeping forces, marking one of the first major interventions of its kind. This new reality demonstrated that unilateral action by former imperial powers would face multilateral scrutiny, a precedent that reshaped future conflicts around the world. The United States' response was decisive and, in many ways, a turning point for its own role as a global superpower. President Eisenhower leveraged economic and diplomatic tools to coerce Britain and France into withdrawing, signaling that Washington now dictated the parameters of acceptable international action. The U.S. position was motivated not only by concern for Arab stability but also by the emerging Cold War, Eisenhower feared that a perception of Western colonial aggression could push Arab nations closer to the Soviet Union, thereby undermining American influence in a strategically vital region. By successfully restraining Britain and France, the United States asserted itself as the ultimate arbiter of international order, demonstrating that economic and diplomatic pressure could outweigh even superior military capability. The Soviet Union, observing the crisis unfold, capitalized on the moment to present itself as a champion of anti-imperialism. Through propaganda and public declarations, Moscow sought to align itself with newly independent nations and nationalist movements, portraying Western powers as remnants of a colonial past. The crisis allowed the Soviet Union to project influence in the Middle East without direct military engagement, expanding its geopolitical footprint and strengthening its position in the Cold War. This illustrated a key lesson of the Suez Crisis. In a rapidly globalizing world, perception and narrative could be as powerful as armies and navies. For Egypt, the Suez Crisis was both a triumph and a challenge. Nasser's bold nationalization had succeeded against the odds, solidifying his reputation as a leader capable of standing up to former imperial powers. The revenue from the canal became a vital resource for national development, including the long-delayed Aswan High Dam project, which symbolized modernity, independence, and self-reliance. Yet the crisis also exposed vulnerabilities. Egypt's military faced limitations and dependence on international support, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, underscored the complexities of asserting independence in a polarized world. Nasser had secured a political victory, but it came with the realization that Egypt's sovereignty would be continuously tested in a global system dominated by superpowers. The Suez Crisis also sent shockwaves throughout the Arab world. Nasser emerged as a unifying figure, and pan-Arab sentiment surged, inspiring movements across the Middle East and North Africa. The crisis showed that even a regional power, when led by a charismatic and strategically minded leader, could challenge traditional hierarchies of power. Anti-colonial movements drew lessons from Nasser's success, recognizing that skillful use of diplomacy, media, and nationalist sentiment could offset superior military capabilities. The psychological impact of the Suez Crisis extended far beyond Egypt's borders, redefining notions of resistance, sovereignty, and post-colonial identity. The conflict also left a lasting imprint on Britain and France. Both nations confronted the harsh reality that their imperial era was ending. Domestically, the crisis fueled debate over the purpose, costs, and morality of maintaining overseas influence. Economically, the confrontation exposed vulnerabilities, highlighting dependence on American financial support and the unsustainability of unilateral military operations. Politically, the debacle weakened the credibility of European powers on the global stage and accelerated the process of decolonization in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. In retrospect, the Suez Crisis was both a symptom and a signal. The old order was breaking down, and new geopolitical realities were asserting themselves with unprecedented speed. Beyond immediate geopolitical shifts, the Suez Crisis underscored the interplay between perception, media, and strategy. Television and newspapers brought images of conflict, military parades, and international condemnation to audiences worldwide. Nasser's speeches, widely broadcast and translated, projected confidence and legitimacy, amplifying his political victory. Conversely, the portrayal of Britain and France as aggressors contributed to their loss of prestige, demonstrating how global public opinion could influence the success or failure of military ventures. The crisis illustrated that in the modern era, perception management had become an integral part of statecraft, capable of shaping outcomes as decisively as military action. The strategic lessons of Suez reverberated through subsequent conflicts. Military planners recognized the limitations of conventional force in the face of international scrutiny, economic leverage, and media attention. Superpowers recalibrated their approach to regional disputes, understanding that local interventions could have disproportionate consequences, if not aligned with broader political realities. Diplomacy, economic incentives, and coalition building emerged as crucial instruments alongside military capability. In essence, the Suez Crisis was a turning point, signaling the transition from colonial-era power projection to a more interconnected, multipolar world where unilateral action was increasingly constrained by global expectations. The long-term legacy of the Suez Crisis also shaped the Middle East. It bolstered the legitimacy of nationalist regimes and inspired movements seeking to reduce Western influence in the region. The crisis highlighted the strategic importance of the Middle East's energy resources and transportation routes, reinforcing the continent's centrality in global politics. For Egypt, the canal became not only an economic lifeline but also a symbol of resilience and independence. Nasser's handling of the crisis elevated him to iconic status, cementing a political model in which assertive leadership, nationalist rhetoric, and strategic diplomacy could achieve remarkable outcomes even against powerful adversaries. In historical analysis, the Suez Crisis continues to be revisited, revealing the complexity of post-colonial transitions. Scholars emphasize that it was not merely a clash over a waterway, but a moment where old empires confronted emerging powers, where diplomacy and economic leverage competed with military might, and where national pride collided with global strategy. The crisis exemplifies how decisions made under pressure, influenced by historical legacies and international constraints, can have consequences far beyond their immediate context. The Suez Canal, once a symbol of European domination, became a testament to the shifting balance of power and the rise of post-colonial agency. Ultimately, the Suez Crisis teaches that history is rarely linear and that international relations are shaped by a convergence of factors: political, economic, cultural, and psychological. Britain and France underestimated the strength of post-colonial nationalism and the influence of emerging superpowers. Nasser capitalized on his understanding of global opinion, economic necessity, and strategic timing to transform a potential crisis into a defining political achievement. The episode underscores the importance of foresight, adaptability, and perception in international affairs. It reminds us that the end of empire was not just a military or economic process, but also a contest of ideas, legitimacy, and political vision. In conclusion, the Suez Crisis was far more than a brief military confrontation over a canal. It was a turning point in the 20th century that redefined global power structures, marked the decline of traditional European empires, elevated the United States as a superpower, and cemented the rise of post-colonial leadership in the Middle East. Nasser's deft handling of the situation demonstrated the potency of nationalism, strategic diplomacy, and media influence in shaping outcomes. The crisis serves as a timeless lesson in the complex interplay of ambition, perception, and power, revealing that history is often determined not by brute force alone, but by the skillful navigation of global realities. The Suez Crisis remains a reminder that the world had entered a new phase one where conventional notions of empire, military dominance, and unilateral action were no longer sufficient to secure influence. Nationalism, media, economic leverage, and global diplomacy had become equally decisive. For students of history, the crisis offers a rich case study in strategy, power, and the unpredictable consequences of asserting sovereignty in an interconnected world. More than 60 years later, the Suez Canal continues to symbolize both the enduring challenges of global politics and the transformative power of decisive leadership, making the crisis as relevant today as it was in 1956.